Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody joining us today. In just a couple of minutes, we're going to get started with today's podcast. But first, I wanted to cover some housekeeping items for today's webinar. Everyone joining has been muted. So if you do have a question, just check out your screen right now. And if you can ask it into the question window of GoToWebinar, we're tracking that window, and we'll try to get to every single one of your questions, either individually or aloud during the Q&A session that we have for all of this webinar today. Once this presentation starts, sometimes people have issues seeing the slides advance. So if that happens to you, just close the webinar and then rejoin it, and that usually fixes things. So as a quick note, we're recording today's AMA, Ask Me Anything, and we'll share the link out with you after the webinar. It usually takes a few days, but we'll be sending a note out to everybody on social once it's ready and once it's posted to YouTube. So with that, we'll make sure everybody's ready to go, and then we'll get started. All right. Thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited to be bringing together the Salesforce DX product team to talk to everyone here today. So just as a quick introduction, we have a bunch of product managers here in the room today. The first one I'd like to introduce to you is Dilip Berkey, and he's the Senior Director of Product Management with Salesforce. You might remember him from the Spring 18 developer preview we did a couple weeks ago. How time flies. It just seems like yesterday that the Spring 18 release came out. But today he's talking a little bit more about packaging and distribution for all of Salesforce. I know we've had a lot of questions about packaging, especially with that latest blog post that Nathan just popped out. So I expect that we'll have a lot to hear about from you today. The next person we've got is...
Hello, everyone. Back. It's great to talk to you again.
Thank you. And so we also are happy to have John Voigt, Senior Director, Product Management with Salesforce. So I think he's joining from Seattle. Is that right, John?
That is correct. Nice and sunny here in Seattle today, as per usual. Conversation.
I stole a joke. So when he's not when he's not relaxing and enjoying the sunshine in Seattle, he is also on the product team, and he's responsible for ALM and how it relates to the Lightning platform. So as everybody knows, we've recently changed the names up a little bit in regards to Force.com and Lightning platform. And if you have questions regarding that and the updates to that in regards to Salesforce DX, be sure to have questions for that, and John can answer you. Next up, sitting next to me here in San Francisco, is Dave Carroll. And you can see from the slide that he's our CLI and DX enthusiast. And when I first started at Salesforce, he was sitting next to me as being a developer evangelist. So I might have a couple of questions about how it might be for him on the Salesforce DX product team side. But I'm sure that the attendees today will have a lot more generally informative questions about developer tools. Salesforce.
Yeah, it's great to be here. This is a fantastic opportunity, and thank you all for attending. We look forward to this because this is a great way for us to hear from you to find out what you're struggling with so that we can make it better.
Yes. Thanks, Dave. We're glad to have you. And finally, on our Ask Me Anything, our AMA panel today, we've got Mr. Wade Wegner, and you might recognize him from our recent developer keynote at this little thing we call Dreamforce last November. So he's the Senior Vice President for Product Management here at Salesforce, and he's steering the ship when it comes to Salesforce DX. So the direction, the intent, the vision for Salesforce DX and how to make things more relevant for people building applications, that's on him. So welcome, Wade.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and thanks everyone for joining.
Before we get started and before we start tackling your questions, if you want to go to the next slide, this wouldn't be a Salesforce presentation without a forward-looking statement, especially as we're going free range with our questions and answers today. So all of the things that our product team is talking about today, it's all great to play around with and experiment with, but please remember to make your purchasing decisions based on what is generally available. So with that said, if we go to the next slide, then Wade's been mentioning a couple of things on Twitter, on the Twitters, if you have any questions to have. And thank you for everybody who responded. Thank you to everybody who responded. If you were waiting for this session to spring questions on us, feel free to start launching them into the question window now, and we'll get to it. Or if you think other people might want to ask a question to this great team while they're in the room, feel free to let them know and have them register and jump in. I think with that said, we'll just mention the next slide very quickly. As I mentioned before, don't wait until the very end to ask your question. Ask the question as soon as it occurs to you, and that increases the chances that we can see it and get the team to answer it. And don't worry if it doesn't pop up immediately or if it doesn't get answered immediately. We see it. We are expecting a lot of questions, so don't worry about repeating the questions and putting it in there twice. And I
think also the questions that we don't get to were during the actual live AMA, we will still answer and then publish later on the developer.salesforce.com site.
That's right, yeah. So if depending on the question, we might just get to it on Twitter, or we might have an all-up post that we would have depending on the questions and what we can answer here. So long story short, questions, we want them. So I think with that said, as we get started, I think it would be super useful for everybody in this call to understand kind of what were we thinking when it came to Salesforce DX and kind of the rationale for creating Salesforce DX and how it kind of fits into the principles of modern software delivery. So with that, Wade, do you want to kind of introduce us all to kind of what's up with this?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I think the best way to look at this as we talk about Salesforce DX today is we have two maybe fundamental goals here. One is to enable all of you to work better together as a team and to work collaboratively around application development on Salesforce. So that is our top goal. And I think as you start to look at what we've been building, the work that we've been doing, it's all really centered around making it easier for you to all work together as teams. And then I think secondly, what we've been focused on is providing better ways with which you can manage the release of these applications that you're building, whether it's updates that you're making to the things that you've built, whether you want to get a bug fix out there. We've really tried to focus on how you can do that continuous delivery, as well as provide mechanisms for everything related to tests, packaging, and so forth within that process. So a lot of details on this slide, and certainly you can dig into Trailhead and our developer documentation to learn more about some of the specifics. But I think what I would point out is for each one of these little circles and each area that we've been focusing on here, it's really been to get to those two core ideas and those two core principles. And so if we look at the next slide, you'll see this reflected in another way, where everything's a continuous process. It never really stops. You're continually adding value back to your users by being able to develop in a more agile way on the Salesforce platform. So, using things like the command line interface, that's really a mechanism to enable you to be more efficient as a developer, as well as to automate the things that you do on the platform. The tools that we're building, the new IDEs, the language services, these are all to make it easier for you to capture and identify challenges earlier in the process so that you don't end up having to deal with them downstream. Scratch orgs is more agile and flexible environments for development and for continuous integration, test automation, and so forth. And then all the way over to the left side of this slide where you've got release management and taking advantage of sandboxes as larger places for user acceptance testing, or testing the changes that you've made in the context of your larger org, or with some of the data that you have for production. All of this kind of fits together in a continuous process and is really part of that coherent application lifecycle management process on Salesforce. So that's, in 30 to 60 seconds, kind of the basis for what it is that we're trying to do with Salesforce DX is, modernize this experience and make you all more productive so that you can spend your time providing value back to your customers and users. And so we've already seen a bunch of questions come in, and they're fantastic. I think we should switch over to the Q&A portion of this pretty quickly, and can tell that you all have a lot of really good questions about these particular topics. So
Great,
why don't we go ahead and do that?
Yeah, thank you for that, Wade. And so for those of you that are tuning in and looking at your screen right now, we're just going to go ahead and leave that one slide entitled Modernize the Developer Experience on the screen. So the guys might share their screen depending on the answer, but just as default, don't worry if you see that visual on your screen for a little while. The guys are just kind of popping up, and well, we're hoping to verbally answer a lot of the questions that you've got going on right now. So with that said, thank you all so much for dropping in your questions. I was monitoring the channel while Wade has been chatting. It looks like we've already got about 60 to 70 questions
wow.
in the last couple of minutes.
That's great.
This is amazing. So thank you all so much. Keep them coming. So let's dive in, shall we? So the first question I've got is, so this is for Wade. So Wade, you GA'd, made generally available Salesforce DX at Dreamforce last year. I think I mentioned that. So what's next for Salesforce DX?
Well, it's a great question, because we've got a great conference coming up where we'll be talking a lot about roadmap. But just to share some of the things that we've been working on, we've continued to focus on what we consider to be the down payment for the developer experience. So what we GA'd at Dreamforce last year, everything from scratch orgs to the command line interface, to all of these new tools and the different ways with which you approach development on the platform, source-driven development, source synchronization, etc. These are all kind of the first steps towards providing this modern developer experience. I think we've been talking a lot about packaging, so we've got a lot of great questions queued up, and Dilip is ready to talk to you about the future of packaging on the platform and how this applies not just to ISVs and to our partners, but also to customers as a mechanism for managing what it is that you're doing in Salesforce and how you release and distribute that. Dave's got a bunch of work queued up around the command line interface and how we're continuing to evolve that. And I think one of the more emergent and exciting areas there is being able to provide third-party plugins that can be used along with the plugins that we provide that drive DX. We've got a lot of tooling updates. You know, Arabella mentioned earlier Nathan Totten's blog post around IDEs, and so we've got a lot of new investments coming in for developers and various IDEs and editors, language services that provide a lot of great opportunities in other editors. And so I think you're going to see, as we answer a lot of these questions that we've got queued up, a lot of the other plans. So enhancements coming to scratch orgs. We've had a pilot that we launched at Dreamforce around the ability to create a scratch org that reflects a production org shape. So that's a very exciting enhancement, and a ton of other things. So we'll explore them throughout the rest, I think, of this Q&A here.
For sure, and thanks for mentioning that blog post. So I don't know if everybody joining today has seen all the noise that we've been making about the Salesforce DX blog series that we've been publishing throughout February, but I just want to take the time before I get to the next question to give a massive shout out to the team. This is a really great series, and it's been super well received. So what happened was that the people that were actually the evangelists who have been going out to different world tours, who have been going out to different events, have been picking up a lot of the questions as well and concerns from the developer community. And so they got together, they had a powwow with the product team here, and had a really great set of content that they've been releasing in a series of blog posts. So the last one we're hoping to drop today or tomorrow, but the parts 1 through 4 are already out online. And one of them actually has a lot of different questions regarding CLI. So I want to have this next question here for Dave. This was repeated in different places, but I like the way it was shown in the blog post. So I think it was for the second blog post discussing CLI, and it's wait, what? Can I use the CLI with any org? So Dave, do you want to spend a little bit of time talking about CLI and how you can use it?
Sure. Yeah, the CLI can be used with any org. There's certain features and functions that we put in the initial versions of the CLI that were very much targeted at the ALM process. In other words, being able to spin up a scratch org, do some local work, push your source, keep those things synced, go into the Scratch org, make some UI changes from setup, and be able to pull those down to stick into source code control. So there are certainly some features that are specific to Scratch org functionality. But going forward, this is part of the roadmap that Wade mentioned, we want to provide additional functionality that supports maybe one-off editing, pushing of source, pulling of source, and so on. Currently today, you can use the metadata API functions for deploy and retrieve in any org that you can access via the API. So that's a developer edition, it's a sandbox org, production org. I don't recommend doing it in production, but developer edition is considered a production org. So it can be used in that way. And so it's just going to be a matter of time before we provide the ability to fetch a single artifact from a random sandbox or other type of org, and likewise to push one up there. This is actually functionality we need to improve our tooling story as well, so that I don't know how many of you have used Maven's Made or the Sublime plugin, but the idea of having something automatically pushed into your org when you save it locally is still a valid thing that we plan on supporting. So yeah, you can definitely target another org. So to try this, just like use the auth web login command and put in the credentials when the web comes up, put in the credentials for your developer edition, and you'll be able to log into that and then have authentication that the CLI knows how to leverage from then on. So
great, thank you for that, Dave. Appreciate it. So if there are follow-on questions, just go ahead and ask them. I hope that answered a lot of the curiosity from developers on that topic. The next question I have here is for Dilip. So it's regarding packaging, and I know that you talked about it, especially with the developer-controlled packages in the latest Spring 18 developer preview. And there was recently another blog post from the team regarding developer-controlled packaging. But I think that's actually triggered a bunch of questions from the community, like specifically around how does packaging 2 sit into things? How many different kinds of packaging do we have going on? And can you kind of shed light, like from a very high level view of what is there and what can people work with?
Absolutely. So I know we have thrown in a lot of terms, and we are in the process of rationalizing those names and reducing the number of terms. But if you're looking at it in terms of, I have a particular use case, which type of packaging I should use, the answer is pretty straightforward. If you're a Salesforce customer, a consultant, a contractor, or a system integrator, you will find that the developer control packages, which it's been a mouthful, so we'll start calling them unlocked packages going forward. Unlocked packages is the single packaging solution that you will use. If you're a Salesforce partner, you have been using first generation packages, and you'll continue to do them as they work with the rest of Salesforce DX. We are in the process of adding feature parity and taking the managed packages to GA, the managed second generation packages to GA, and when that is available, you switch over to that. So you're a customer or you're an SI, you will use unlocked packages, and that's a single solution that will start pushing forward as we go.
Okay, great. So the next question we've got here, thank you for that, Dilip. The next question we have here was straight from the audience, and looks like it's for John. So this question is, I have inherited an org where nothing has been imported into a source control repository. Is there any documentation or best practices I should follow to begin using source control and Salesforce DX? And there's a second question here nested after this one from the same person asking. Also, my company is thoroughly entrenched, I think is the word we're looking for here, entrenched in Microsoft technology, and management would prefer to use TFS. I know TFS supports a Git compatible mode. Are there any issues with using TFS natively or in Git mode? That's kind of a mouthful there, John, so if I'm hoping you can catch that. Do you have anything you wanted to say about that question?
Yep. So if you're starting out with a brand new org that you've inherited, that has not been pulled out into source control system, I think in a lot of ways this is similar to anyone that has their own current org that they're looking to start doing development towards with Salesforce DX. The things that you need to do are to logically start thinking about what has been put into that org. Org development prior to DX has been done in a way where you consider the entire org as a single container. And with Salesforce DX, we give you the ability to enforce sort of a modular development process with the goal to deploy packages into that org instead of just managing it as one big container. So instead of one big thing, you have lots of packages in there. So as a first step, I think you really need to kind of audit your org. Think about what's in there. What are the people that are adding to that org? Are there different groups? Are there different applications? And once you have a good understanding of how the org is broken down, the way to do it is to look for projects that really fit as isolated modules and start to extract just that source. So don't look to extract your entire org unless that org is literally just one app. Most likely it's lots of different things. So extract what you can work on as a module, and you can do that with the Metadata API. The Metadata API allows you to build up a package.xml file where you can specify explicitly what you want to pull out from the org. And as you do that, you just iterate over building the source for that module using package XMLs and metadata retrieved from that org. There are also ways in the UI where you can get some understanding of things that are related. We mentioned in our documentation to use the unmanaged package interface. Now, this is not because you're creating an unmanaged package. It's just because that interface has a capability called a spider, which helps you better understand dependencies. That's the only reason we recommend that you use that interface, is because the spider helps you figure out dependencies. So using that interface, you can select an entity and then realize what is related to that entity, and then that'll help you to build up that package XML and understand what to retrieve. What was the second question?
So the second question was also my company is thoroughly entrenched in
TFS.
The VCS question, yeah. The fact that Salesforce DX gives you, or our APIs give you the ability to extract, set up metadata as files, that means that once you have files on the file system, you can integrate with any source control system. So I know most of our documentation speaks to Git, and that's because Git happens to be the most popular version control system in software development right now. So we typically do our documentation around that. But the fact that you can have files on your file system means that those files can then be integrated into any VCS system. So TFS should be just fine.
Great, thank you for that, John. Appreciate it. Let's see, I'll mix it up a little bit. So I'll throw this question out here, and whoever wants to jump on it first, totally go for it. Any plans to break apart profile and permission set metadata, similar to how object metadata is split?
That's a great one. This is Wade. I'll try to jump in here. So this is a great question, and I will say it's one of the most challenging parts about decomposing your org. I'll give a few pieces of advice, and then I'll provide some additional context and invite others to share. First off is, as much as possible, we recommend you start taking advantage of perm sets. Perm sets inherently become a great way to define the what and who inside of the context of your app. You can start to think about actually creating perm sets specific to the thing that you are externalizing into a Salesforce DX project. I invite you all to look at the Dreamhouse app that Christoph on the developer evangelism team maintains. I think this is a great example of a logical app that's defined inside of a Salesforce DX project. And you'll note that there's a perm set file in there that specifies exactly who and what has access to that app, and it's specified in that project. So the more that you can move to perm sets, the better off you'll be. I know that there are cases where sometimes the granularity of perm sets becomes a little bit too much, meaning that you'd end up having to create too many perm sets to define kind of the macro set of permissions that you want to define. And so this is a forward-looking statement, but the team that builds perm sets is looking at how to define perm set groups. So it is something that they are working on more and more. The last thing that I'll mention is when it comes to DX, I think the approach that we found to work best is, whenever possible, manage profiles independently. And there are plenty of cases where you cannot get away from profiles today, and those are areas that we're working on right now, making it easier for you to be able to actually break the profile apart. But as much as possible, what we actually do in practice, and what we see a lot of people do, is use the force ignore file inside of the Salesforce DX project to actually explicitly exclude profiles, so that the profile assignment becomes more of an administrative task that you do later versus something that you pull around in your source. And again, this is not something that'll work 100% of the time, but in most cases, this will help solve a lot of the challenges that you see as you start to try to break things apart. So just to recap, err on the side of perm sets whenever possible. Note that we are looking at providing groups around that, and then as much as possible, try to actually exclude the profile from that project.
Great, thank you. Let's see here. So thanks for that, Wade. So the next question we've got here is, I've gone through some of the tutorials around converting existing code to DX, and have gotten as far as trying to deploy everything to a Scratch org. When I do so, however, I get pages and pages and pages of errors. They're all varying types. I'm just wondering if I'm starting too big, or if there's a strategy when trying to convert a bunch of pre-existing code. So does, John, I think that might be a good question for you to answer. Do you want to jump on that one?
Sure. So the strategy that I was mentioning before is about trying to understand the modules that you're putting together. So a difference with Salesforce DX, and probably one of the things you're running into, is that a Scratch org is an empty org, from the standpoint that the entirety of the setup configuration that is in your production org, it's not copied automatically into a Scratch org like it is in a sandbox. So when you think about DX development with a Scratch org, you have to think in modules that can be isolated and worked on by themselves. So if you're running into errors, it's likely it could be because the source that's required to meet dependencies is not with the source that you're pushing. And in other cases, it's because the org itself and how it's set up, the org shape, isn't specified correctly. Maybe there's a feature that's missing, or there's a setting or preference that's missing. So how can we address these things? So the first thing to do in looking through your errors is I would start with looking at org shape. And sometimes this can be a difficult thing. So I would start by looking at org shape and see if you can specify what's missing as far as features and preferences. If you run into a blocker there, though, understand that we are working on something on the side called an org shape configuration, or excuse me, an org shape template. Now, this is a capability that will be coming out to beta later this year. But what this will allow you to do is extract the org shape of a production org that you want to develop to. That way, you don't have to manually specify the org shape in a Scratch definition file. So this will be coming out later this year, and I think it's going to help a lot of our customers in creating the org shape for their Scratch orgs. So again, try to specify around manually creating the Scratch definition. If you hit a blocker, please report it to us in our Trailblazer community, and we'll try to work with you on getting that fixed. But also understand that we've got an ultimate solution coming later this year. Now, once org shape is managed, the next step is looking at the actual source that you're pushing into the org. So if you are still running into issues and managing dependencies, you're just going to need to pull in more source to fill out that specific module. That might be a little basic of an answer, but I'm not sure how to sort of specify more than that, as source can differ from org to org. Does anyone else add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. This is Dave. We do have several research threads going on internally to kind of try to do some analysis of the metadata to determine dependencies and direction of dependencies and strengths of dependencies. We realize this is a big task, and we have some ideas on how to solve it, but they're pretty early days at this point.
Great, thank you for that, Dave. John, did you want to add anything additional to that, or?
Nope.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm just pulling up the next question here. Okay, this is a meaty one. It is calling out documentation, and I will not read the URL. It is calling out a specific documentation. Per documentation, there are quite a few component types that are currently supported in developer-controlled packages, but that are not supported and managed, that is second generation packages. Is the goal to make all of these types supported in both DCP and managed second generation packages? The one that this person is most interested in is quick action.
Thanks for asking this question. So when we look at developer control packages or unlocked packages, the vision is to support everything that you can do with Metadata API. So with Spring 18, we have opened this up so that pretty much anything that you can do via a metadata deploy, you should be able to do with unlocked packages. As far as managed packages are concerned, as you know, every component has a set of manageability rules, which would require us to work with the individual feature team to ensure that these manageability rules are very well defined and codified. So the path, as we look at managed packages, when we look at managed packages, we want to have parity with what is already present in first generation packages. So to answer your question, things like quick actions, we want to support with managed packages. But having said that, as you know, the set of components that are supported in managed packages is a subset of the set of things that are supported in Metadata API, and that will stay for a while. Separately, there is another initiative that is undergoing within Salesforce platform, where we want to make every feature that Salesforce rolls out work really well in DX, work really well with unlocked packages, and have a really good story for ISVs. So you will see in upcoming releases our investing effort to ensure that any new feature that Salesforce pushes out has coverage in all forms of use cases.
Great, thank you for that. There is so much curiosity about packaging right now. So, and I think the next question we've got here is, this is a good one. So for someone getting started with Salesforce DX, which tool set do you recommend? The NuForce IDE VS Code with extensions, clips? What's going on for tool sets?
Yeah, I'll take that. So even if you're not just getting started, the best tool set to use today is going to be Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code provides wrappers around a lot of the functionality of the CLI. We've created extensions to support this. We also have language server embedded into the Visual Studio Code so that you get things like code complete. You can run tests on a single method from a single click. You can jump around to definitions in your Apex code, so on and so forth. So that combined with the CLI, which by the way can be run from the embedded terminal inside of VS Code, makes it the primary tool to take a look at. We have an IDE 2 that is deprecated today. The IDE 2 is an Eclipse plugin that was intended to support the DX process. And we've since decided to go a different direction, a more modern direction with our tooling, that being VS Code. IDE 1 does some things that VS Code doesn't, and so it's our, we don't claim that we've got victory on VS Code until we have parity with IDE 1, and at that point in time, IDE 1 will also start to be deprecated. It doesn't mean we're going to take it away or prevent it from working, but it just means that we're not going to do additional development on it. I think that it's currently an open source project, so it's going to stay an open source project. But as far as new development around our tooling, we have chosen Visual Studio Code as the path forward.
Right. And this is also covered in Nathan's latest blog post, right?
I think it is.
Yeah. Okay. So just check out that that post on salesforce.developers.com/blog if you want to know more about that. Meanwhile, thank you for that, Dave. The next question that we've got is, probably John can answer this one. Is there any hard limit on the size of metadata that we can push to a scratch org on without using artifact structure?
So the source push commands within that are used with Salesforce DX, CLI, and Salesforce CLI and VS Code are backed by Metadata API. So the Metadata API limit is 10,000 files. So in a project as it is set right now, the limit on the push would be 10,000 files. So this kind of goes with some of the other questions that I'm seeing where people are asking about sort of extracting their entire sandbox and switching it over. I just want to reiterate that, again, the intent for this is not to source control your entire org. The intent is to look at your org and how it would be broken up into modules, their respective modules, assuming your org is something that can be broken up into those modules. So the intention here is that you can break things down into smaller, more manageable units. So the answer to this question, the specific limit is 10,000 files, and then the related to some of the questions around extracting or breaking down your entire sandbox. Again, I would stop before you do that and really ask yourself, is the entire sandbox just one thing? I would venture to guess that it isn't, but perhaps in your particular use case it is.
Okay, thank you for that, John. It sounds like we had a hard number for that one, but double check before sticking to that one. Just to zoom out for a really big question, we've seen a lot of questions on kind of pricing and I guess robustness would be the best way to describe it. Really big question. I'm not sure if this is Wade, if this is for you, but we've seen similar questions on this one. Is Salesforce DX enterprise ready? That's a big question. So who wants to jump on that one?
I can answer. I'll just say yes. We can move on.
There we go. Done. Well, how much does it cost?
More seriously, I think absolutely. I mean, the thing that I'll point out about Salesforce DX is, pretty much for the most part, what we've done to John's example just a moment ago is we've built on existing APIs and capabilities. We've really just focused on being able to unencumber you and allow you to use the tools and kind of practices and processes that make you productive as teams. So, helping you to externalize your source. Allowing you to use things like CLI in order to automate and to do development faster, those sorts of things. So absolutely, it's enterprise ready. Does that mean that we don't have some edge cases that we're still working on and need to get functional? Absolutely not. So we know that there's still more to do. I think that kind of speaks to the point that I made earlier about the down payment that we made, and that there's still a lot more that we're focused on. In terms of the pricing question, Salesforce DX is available for everyone to use. There's no cost. The way that we actually structure it is that scratch orgs are an entitlement that is based on the license that you have purchased. So you have a different number of scratch orgs that you can have at any point in time. We call these active scratch orgs. And so based on the license of your org, whether it's Enterprise Edition, Ultimate, etc., you'll get a certain number of scratch orgs. And if you need more, there are opportunities to go ahead and purchase additional scratch orgs. But the point is there's no cost associated with Salesforce DX, and it's available for anyone building on the platform to use.
Okay, thanks for that, Wade. Let's see here. So the next question we have here is regarding packages, specifically packages and how they work with AppExchange. So Dilip, this is probably a good question for you. So this is, how does it work when there are AppExchange packages that our development is dependent on? How does this dependency work in the scenario with scratch orgs and sandboxes? So how do they fit together?
That's a wonderful question. So as you start exploring unlocked packages, you will see that we've invested a lot of effort in providing this modular development processes. So when you look at developer control packages or unlocked packages, you can start declaring dependencies at build time to say that a particular package depends on another package. So to take the specific use case that you mentioned, maybe you have purchased an AppExchange app and want to do a bunch of customizations there. And these customizations, you want to wrap it in an unlocked package. The way you would go about doing that is when you build the unlocked package in the SFDX project.json, you'll specify that you depend on this AppExchange package. And then the system is smart enough to get that some of the things that you're referring to, maybe you've added some things in the developer control package that depends on the AppExchange package, and we take care of that for you. So in the scratch org, you'll install the AppExchange app, and then you will do development, or you run CI with the unlocked package that is installed in scratch org. There is an FAQ, so if you're part of the Trailblazer community for Salesforce DX and packaging, you will see that I posted a set of FAQs, and I realized that when it comes to a lot of aspects about packages, there are a lot of detailed questions. So my hope is to use that frequently asked questions section to keep updating and answering questions. And there you will see a few examples of how to declare dependencies among packages.
Great. So you have the FAQ, and if people have further questions, they can ask you on Twitter.
That's right.
Or rather, go to the Trailblazer community.
I highly recommend going to the Trailblazer community because you get the benefit of hearing from your colleagues. The responses that we post is available for other Trailblazers who come along. So we highly encourage you to use the Trailblazer community.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dilip. So the next question we have here is regarding converting existing sandboxes to a scratch org. So the question is, what is the best way to convert an existing sandbox to a scratch org? I followed the recommended approach of creating a package and retrieving it, converting from MDAPI to SFDX format, and pushing to the scratch org. I got a lot of errors. I tried an alternative approach. Basically, the core of this is they're throwing a lot of errors when they follow the recommended approach. Some errors are including custom pick list values. For example, case status could not be included in the package. Standard object permissions are not included in the packages when adding profiles. For example, account view all. They enabled entitlements, but milestone time settings were not checked. So this sounds like this core problem with throwing a lot of errors when following the recommended approach is something that's probably being seen by a lot of the developers here. So is there any further guidance that we can offer in this webinar?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. This is Wade. So I think this gets back to a point John made earlier, that it is hard to get started. One thing that we do when you see lots of errors, it's generally not that you've got that many errors. There's usually one error somewhere in the chain that has caused a set of additional errors to be thrown because some condition wasn't met. So that speaks to John's point before. We do not recommend taking everything that you have in a sandbox and just trying to take a package XML or the unmanaged package that you've created in there and throw everything in there and just pull it out, because there are going to be things that exist in that sandbox or production environment that you very well may not be able to externalize, and that will cause some cascading errors. Instead, it is far better to think about what is it that you're trying to do, what's the thing that you want to build, what is the thing that you're trying to fix in production, what's the feature you want to enable, and to approach it from that perspective first. So again, I would say think about that example of the Dreamhouse app and imagine a fictional company that had an org that had hired Christoph to build Dreamhouse for them. Christoph with DX would not have said, let's take everything that exists in this org and get started in that scratch org so that I can build the Dreamhouse. Again, he started with a set of metadata that he continued to layer on and pulling specific dependencies that exist in that org into that project. So the way that we recommend it is, if you're finding a lot of errors, take a look at the approach that you're taking. Try to look at something a little bit smaller scale and think about how you can address a particular thing first and then deploy that into that production environment. That will help you to be successful and start to wrangle and to get some control over that production environment, or sandbox in this case.
Hey Wade, this is Dave. I would also it's kind of hard to think about that your entire org. And one way that I think is useful is think about the business process that whatever those customizations that you've implemented represent. Typically, we're asked to enable some capability for our end users, and that is a business process. And if you can limit to a single business process, then you're going to have a better opportunity to kind of separate the dependencies. And so instead of thinking about, oh, I have a bunch of customizations to our sales process, try to figure out what it was that your boss asked you to do. Was it to enable us to be able to look up data from an external service and include that in a sidebar or something like that, and make that your process? And think about those business processes then as modules, and then you can start to reason about the org in a much more tangible way.
Great, thanks for that, Dave, for jumping in there. Wade, did you have anything further you wanted to add to that, or John or Delete?
I think this is good.
Yeah? Okay, thank you. So the next question, since you already jumped in there, Dave, I have another question for you.
Okay.
So this is regarding the CLI. So we want to export data from our development org and import it into our Scratch org using CLI. I'm guessing that's a pretty common use case. The data set has many master detail relationships. Is there a way for us to export several levels of master detail relationships and import using the CLI commands under force data, maybe using the plan flag?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and one that is something that I am pretty passionate about, and that we also are exploring a couple of different options for. Currently today, there's some data import export capability. You can import individual JSON files or export them via SOCL to a CSV style format or a JSON style format. And then there's also a way to export what we call a data plan. And the data plan actually provides the cross-reference information between related data sets to be able to establish those relationships on import. And I think this question, whoever asked this question has probably tried to do that and realized that, well, there's some limitations on that. One of which is, how do I craft a SOCL statement that that establishes those relationships that the data plan can understand, and how do I do that more than a single level deep? I think that what we've given you today is a bit naive for data import and export, and I personally am pursuing a couple of different avenues to get something that's more robust. Along the lines that we hear around the data plan or the data import export is, I'm limited to a couple hundred records. It doesn't support record types. My admin won't let me extract data, production data from my org, and so the solution that I'm looking at is much more comprehensive to allow the developer to either generate data based on the schema that is within their org, or to mask data, to handle the record types and so on. So that is a high priority on the roadmap for the CLI. It doesn't really solve your problem today. I would like to point out that in any case, the data import-export is not meant to be a data migration type of thing, but limited to small sets of data. If you need to do some kind of UAT or performance testing, that's when you push your modules and packages to Sandbox to do that. So stay tuned. There's a lot of questions and complaints about the support for this, and so it's a very high priority for me.
So now we all know the guy responsible and who to yell at if things go wrong. His name is Dave.
Sure. Why not?
Okay, so we're running up on time. So unfortunately, we've had so many questions, and we are super excited. I'm excited, and by extension, the product team is excited.
We have a lot of homework.
We got a lot of homework. So I think the things I'm taking away from this is these questions are all, once we start kind of adding up the thematic similarities between them, I'm seeing so many things we can start doing to help everybody out and help make their development more efficient. So based on your questions, we're going to work on further ways to share information. What that looks like, we still need to figure out with the team. So is it going to be blog posts? Is it going to be like improvements to reference apps? One thing I can say for sure, if you go to the if we go to the slide here, is we have a lot of resources, because you can skip that one for now, and go to, we have a lot of resources. So if you're already not familiar with kind of like this diving in to Salesforce DX and on Trailhead, if you haven't done that yet and you're still running into some speed bumps in terms of adopting Salesforce DX, go ahead and try those out. If you haven't seen them in a while, it's probably a nice refresher. But more immediately pertinent to the people who have already gotten started with Salesforce DX, these guys are going to be at Trailhead DX. So everybody here will be in San Francisco. And we're actually going to be having a few sessions. And the information that we've gathered here is super valuable. So what I'm hoping is that when we throw these guys on stage in late March, we will already have answers to what we couldn't get to in this Ask Me Anything session. So ideally, we'll have solved a problem or two that have been highlighted in this webinar that we've had today. In addition, all of these guys are going to be around. They're going to be walking around in Moscone West. They might have a booth shift. So if you have further questions for them, then you can chase them down and they can't go anywhere. So I wanted to take a quick moment here. If you have any further questions, then go ahead and ask them publicly. Of course, we're going to close this Q&A window and go to webinar. So I just want to note the further things you can do. You can ask online on Twitter. You can go to the Trailblazer community, or you can ping these guys individually, and they'll get someone to look at something. And one more time, if you want to hit us up on Twitter, go for it. Thank you all again for joining us. So Wade and John calling in from Seattle, and Dave and Dilip here in the room, and a special shout out to Natala and Amber, who have been helping out quite a lot on this session today. Don't forget to answer the survey. We're always trying to make this better with every webinar. And thank you all again today. Looking forward to the next one.